HMS Royal Oak was one of 5 Revenge-class battleships built for the Royal Navy during World War I. Completed in 1916, she first saw action at the Battle of Jutland as part of the Grand Fleet. In peacetime, Royal Oak served in various fleets, including the Atlantic, Home, and Mediterranean fleets, occasionally facing accidental attacks. In 1928, the ship drew global attention when her senior officers were controversially court-martialed, causing significant embarrassment to the Royal Navy, which was then the world's largest. Despite efforts to modernize her during her 25-year career, Royal Oak's lack of speed remained a problem, making her unsuitable for frontline duty by the start of World War II. On October 14, 1939, Royal Oak was anchored at Scapa Flow in Orkney, Scotland, when the German submarine U-47 torpedoed her. Of the 1,234 crew members, 835 were killed or died later from their wounds. Although the loss of the outdated ship, the first of 5 Royal Navy battleships and battlecruisers sunk in World War II, did not significantly impact the numerical superiority of the British Navy and its allies, it greatly affected wartime morale. The raid made an immediate celebrity and war hero of U-boat commander Günther Prien, the first German submarine officer to receive the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. Before this attack, the Royal Navy believed Scapa Flow was impregnable to submarine attacks, but U-47's raid showed that the German Navy could bring the war to British home waters. This shock led to rapid changes in dockland security and the construction of the Churchill barriers around Scapa Flow, which also served as roads connecting the islands. The wreck of Royal Oak, designated a war grave, lies almost upside down in 100 feet of water with her hull just 16 feet below the surface. Each year, Royal Navy divers place a white ensign at her stern to mark the loss. Unauthorized divers are prohibited from approaching the wreck under the Protection of Military Remains Act 1986. Design and description. The Revenge-class ships were designed to be smaller, slower, and better protected than their predecessors, the Queen Elizabeth-class battleships. Initially, they were supposed to use both coal and fuel oil to save costs, but in October 1914, First Sea Lord Jackie Fisher decided they would only use oil. During construction, they switched to oil-fired boilers, boosting the engine power by 9,000 horsepower. HMS Royal Oak, a sister ship of HMS Revenge, was completed in 1916. She measured 620 feet in length, had a beam of 88 feet, and a draft of 33 feet. Designed to displace 27,790 tons, she could reach 31,130 tons when fully loaded. Powered by Parsons steam turbines and 18 Yarrow boilers, her engines were rated at 40,000 horsepower, aiming for a top speed of 23 knots. However, during sea trials in May 1916, she only reached 22 knots. Royal Oak had a range of 7,000 nautical miles at a cruising speed of 10 knots, and her crew consisted of 909 officers and men in 1916. The Revenge class featured 8 15-inch guns and 4 twin turrets, positioned fore and aft of the superstructure. They also had 14 6-inch guns, with 12 encasemates along the sides and 2 on the shelter deck. Their anti-aircraft armament included 2 3-inch quick-firing guns. The ships were equipped with 4 submerged 21-inch torpedo tubes, 2 on each side. Royal Oak had 2 fire control directors with 15-foot rangefinders. One was above the conning tower, the other in the spotting top of the tripod foremast. Each turret had a 15-foot rangefinder, and the main guns could be controlled from the X-turret. The secondary armament was managed by directors on each side of the compass platform on the foremast. A torpedo control director was mounted at the aft end of the superstructure. The ship's armor included a 13-inch thick Krupp cemented belt between the A and Y barbets, tapering to 4 to 6 inches towards the ends. Above this was a 6-inch strake extending between A and X barbets. The turrets had armor ranging from 11 to 13 inches, with 4.75 to 5-inch roofs. The barbets were 6 to 10 inches thick above the upper deck and 4 to 6 inches below. The decks had armor thicknesses ranging from 1 to 4 inches. The main conning tower had 13-inch sides and a 3-inch roof, while the torpedo director had 6 inches of armor. After the Battle of Jutland, an additional inch of high-tensile steel was added over the magazines, and extra anti-flash equipment was installed. In 1918, Royal Oak was fitted with flying-off platforms on the B and X turrets for launching fighters and reconnaissance aircraft. These platforms were removed in 1934, replaced by a catapult on the X turret roof and a crane to recover seaplanes. Major alterations made to Royal Oak started between 1922 and 1924, with significant upgrades to her anti-aircraft defenses. The original 3-inch AA guns were replaced with a pair of QF 4-inch guns. A 30-foot rangefinder was added to B turret, along with a simple high-angle rangefinder above the bridge. Her underwater protection was enhanced with anti-torpedo bulges, which reduced the impact of torpedoes and improved stability. This modification widened the ship's beam by over 13 feet. The changes increased her beam to 102 feet and reduced her draft to 29 feet 6 inches. The modifications also raised her metacentric height to 6.3 feet at deep load and increased her crew to 1,188. Despite these additions, she could still reach a speed of 21.75 knots. In a brief 1927 refit, 2 more 4-inch AA guns were added, and the 6-inch guns on the shelter deck were removed. By 1931, a high-angle control system replaced the high-angle rangefinder on the spotting top, and 2 years later, the aft torpedo tubes were removed. Between 1934 and 1936, Royal Oak underwent her final refit. The deck armor was increased to 5 inches over the magazines and 3.5 inches over the engine rooms. Her anti-aircraft defenses were further improved by replacing the single mounts of the AA guns with twin mounts for the QF 4-inch Mark 16 gun. Additionally, a pair of octuple mounts for 2-pounder pom-pom guns were added to sponsons abreast the funnel. New platforms were installed for pom-pom anti-aircraft directors, one on each side of the fire control director and the spotting top. A high-angle control system Mark III director replaced the earlier model in the spotting top, and another replaced the torpedo director aft. A pair of quadruple mounts for Vickers .50 machine guns were installed abreast the conning tower. The mainmast was rebuilt as a tripod to support the weight of a radio direction finding office and a second high-angle control station. The forward pair of submerged torpedo tubes were removed, and 4 experimental 21-inch torpedo tubes were added above water forward of A turret. Construction and service. First World War, Battle of Jutland. Picture this, it's the early hours of May 31, 1916. And the German High Seas Fleet has set sail from Jade, aiming to lure out and destroy part of the British Grand Fleet. Their formidable lineup includes 16 dreadnoughts, 6 pre-dreadnoughts, 6 light cruisers, and 31 torpedo boats, moving in concert with Rear Admiral Franz von Hipper's 5 battlecruisers and their supporting ships. But the British Royal Navy's Room 40 has intercepted and decoded German radio communications, revealing their plans. Admiral John Jellicoe, commanding the Grand Fleet of 28 dreadnoughts and 9 battlecruisers, receives orders to intercept the Germans. As the day progresses, the two mighty fleets converge off the Danish coast. The initial engagements are fierce, with British and German battlecruisers exchanging heavy fire. By 6 p.m., the main British fleet arrives on the scene, and Admiral Jellicoe orders his fleet to prepare for action, positioning them strategically. At 6:29 p.m., Royal Oak opens fire on the German cruiser Wiesbaden, unleashing 4 salvos in quick succession and scoring a hit on the cruiser's aft. The Germans return fire, but Royal Oak remains unscathed. As the battle intensifies, German torpedo boats attempt to reach Wiesbaden. Mistaking the move for a torpedo attack, Royal Oak's secondary guns open fire. By 7:15 p.m., Royal Oak's gunners spot the German battlecruisers and engage the lead ship, HMS Derfflinger. Initially overestimating the range, they soon correct their aim and score 2 hits. When Derfflinger vanishes in the haze, Royal Oak targets the next battlecruiser, HMS Seydlitz, scoring another hit before Seydlitz also disappears into the mist. Meanwhile, a German torpedo boat flotilla launches an attack on the British battle line. Royal Oak's secondary guns fire first, quickly followed by the rest of the fleet. After this exchange, the High Seas Fleet withdraws. Confusion over the German fleet's exact position and course means Jellicoe cannot bring his fleet into full action. By 9:30 p.m., the Grand Fleet begins reorganizing into its nighttime cruising formation. Early on June 1st, the Grand Fleet combs the area, searching for damaged German ships but finding none. Throughout the battle, Royal Oak fires 38 rounds from her main battery and 84 rounds from her secondary guns. The Battle of Jutland was a massive naval engagement, demonstrating the strategic might and tactical prowess of both the British and German navies. Despite the chaos and confusion, the experience gained in this battle would inform naval strategies for years to come. Later actions. After the Battle of Jutland, Royal Oak was moved to the 1st Battle Squadron. On August 18, 1916, the Germans made another sortie, this time targeting Sunderland. Vice Admiral Reinhard Scheer, leading the German fleet, aimed to draw out and destroy the British battlecruisers. However, British signals intelligence decoded German communications, allowing Admiral Jellicoe to position the Grand Fleet to intercept. Both sides pulled back after their submarines inflicted losses on August 19. The British cruisers Nottingham and Falmouth were sunk by German U-boats, and the German battleship SMS Westfalen was damaged by the British submarine E-23. Jellicoe then ordered the fleet to avoid the southern half of the North Sea due to the high risk from mines and U-boats. In late 1917, German destroyers and light cruisers began raiding British convoys to Norway. This forced the British to deploy capital ships to protect these convoys. In April 1918, the German fleet made another attempt to catch an isolated British squadron, but the convoy had already passed safely. The Grand Fleet reacted too late to intercept the Germans, although the battlecruiser SMS Moltke was torpedoed and badly damaged by the submarine HMS E-42. On November 5, 1918, just before the war ended, Royal Oak was anchored off Burnt Island in the Firth of Forth, along with the seaplane tender Campania and the light battlecruiser Glorious. A sudden force 10 squall caused Campania to drag her anchor and collide with both Royal Oak and Glorious. While both capital ships only suffered minor damage, Campania was holed by the initial collision with Royal Oak, causing her engine rooms to flood. She sank 5 hours later, fortunately without any loss of life. After Germany's surrender in November 1918, the Allies interned most of the High Seas Fleet at Scapa Flow. The fleet met the British light cruiser Cardiff, which led them to the Allied fleet assigned to escort the Germans to Scapa Flow. This impressive escort included 370 British, American, and French warships. The High Seas Fleet stayed captive during the Treaty of Versailles negotiations. On June 21, 1919, with the treaty's signing deadline looming, Konteradmiral Ludwig von Reuter believed the British planned to seize the German ships. That morning, while the Grand Fleet was out on training maneuvers, von Reuter ordered the scuttling of the High Seas Fleet. 1920s. During the peacetime reorganization of the Royal Navy, Royal Oak was assigned to the 2nd Battle Squadron of the Atlantic Fleet. Following a significant refit from 1922 to 1924, she was transferred in 1926 to the Mediterranean Fleet, stationed at Grand Harbor in Malta. In early 1928, a notorious event, later dubbed the Royal Oak Mutiny by the press, unfolded. It began as a simple dispute over the band at a ship's wardroom dance between Rear Admiral Bernard Collard and Royal Oak's 2 senior officers, Captain Kenneth Dewar and Commander Henry Daniel. This minor disagreement quickly spiraled into a bitter personal feud lasting several months. Dewar and Daniel accused Collard of vindictive fault-finding and publicly humiliating them before the crew. In response, Collard countered that the 2 officers were failing to follow orders and treating him worse than a midshipman. The conflict escalated to the point where Dewar and Daniel wrote letters of complaint to Collard's superior, Vice Admiral John Kelly. Kelly passed these letters on to Admiral Sir Roger Keyes, the Commander-in-Chief, who realized that the relationship had broken down irreparably. Keyes quickly convened a board of inquiry, resulting in all 3 men being removed from their posts and sent back to England. The board of inquiry met on the eve of a major naval exercise, which Keyes had to postpone. This caused rumors to fly around the fleet that Royal Oak had experienced a mutiny. The press picked up the story, describing it with some exaggeration, and it gained worldwide attention. Public interest in the scandal reached such a level that the King summoned the First Lord of the Admiralty, William Bridgeman, for an explanation. For their letters of complaint, Dewar and Daniel were controversially charged with writing subversive documents. In highly publicized courts-martial held in Gibraltar, both were found guilty and severely reprimanded, leading Daniel to resign from the Navy. Collard, criticized for his conduct by both the press and Parliament, was denounced by Bridgeman as unfitted to hold further high command and was forcibly retired from service. Only Dewar managed to continue his career, though it was significantly damaged. He remained in the Royal Navy but held a series of minor commands. His promotion to Rear Admiral, typically a formality, was delayed until the following year, just 1 day before his retirement. Daniel attempted a career in journalism, but his efforts were unsuccessful, and he faded into obscurity in South Africa. Collard retreated to private life and never spoke publicly about the incident again, though he was promoted to Vice Admiral on the retired list in April 1931. The scandal was a major embarrassment for the Royal Navy, then the world's largest navy. It was satirized both at home and abroad through editorials, cartoons, and even a comic jazz oratorio composed by Erwin Schulhoff. As a result of this damaging affair, the Admiralty reviewed how naval officers could formally complain about their superiors' conduct. This review aimed to prevent such incidents from causing further harm to the Royal Navy's reputation. 1930s. During the Spanish Civil War, Royal Oak was assigned to non-intervention patrols around the Iberian Peninsula. While patrolling 30 nautical miles east of Gibraltar on February 2, 1937, she came under aerial attack by 3 Republican aircraft. They dropped 3 bombs, 2 of which exploded within a few hundred yards of her starboard bow, but caused no damage. The British Chargé d'Affaires protested to the Republican government, which admitted its mistake and apologized for the attack. Later that month, on February 23, while stationed off Valencia during a nationalist aerial bombardment, Royal Oak was accidentally struck by an anti-aircraft shell fired from a Republican position, injuring 5 men, including her captain, T.B. Drew. The British did not protest this incident, considering it an act of God. In May 1937, Royal Oak and HMS Forester escorted the SS Abana, carrying thousands of Basque child refugees, to Southampton docks. In July, as the war in northern Spain intensified, Royal Oak, along with her sister ship HMS Resolution, rescued the steamer Gordonia when Spanish nationalist warships attempted to capture it off Santander. However, on July 14, she was unable to prevent the nationalist cruiser Almirante Cervera from seizing the British freighter Moulton as it tried to enter Santander, where it had been involved in evacuating refugees. During this period, Royal Oak starred alongside 14 other Royal Navy vessels in the 1937 British film melodrama Our Fighting Navy. The film, which centers on a coup in the fictional South American Republic of Bianco, was used by the Royal Navy as a recruitment tool. Royal Oak portrayed the rebel battleship Almirante, whose commander forces a British captain, played by Robert Douglas, to choose between his lover and his duty. Though the film was poorly received by critics, it was noted for its dramatic naval action scenes. In 1938, Royal Oak returned to the home fleet and became the flagship of the 2nd Battle Squadron based in Portsmouth. On November 24, 1938, she returned the body of Queen Maud of Norway, who had died in London, to Oslo for a state funeral, accompanied by her husband, King Haakon VII. After being paid off in December 1938, Royal Oak was recommissioned the following June. In 1939, she embarked on a short training cruise in the English Channel to prepare for another 30-month tour of the Mediterranean, with her crew issued tropical uniforms. However, as war loomed, the battleship was sent north to Scapa Flow, where she was anchored when war was declared on September 3, 1939. Second World War. As the phony war dragged on, Royal Oak saw little action. However, in October 1939, she joined the search for the Gneisenau, which had ventured into the North Sea as a distraction for the commerce-raiding heavy cruisers Deutschland and Admiral Graf Spee. The mission proved fruitless, especially for Royal Oak, whose top speed, now less than 20 knots, was insufficient to keep pace with the fleet. On October 12, Royal Oak returned to Scapa Flow in poor condition, having been battered by North Atlantic storms. Her Carly floats were smashed, and several smaller caliber guns were inoperable due to flooding. This mission highlighted the obsolescence of the 25-year-old battleship. Amid concerns of an impending air attack on Scapa Flow, sparked by recent German reconnaissance flights, Admiral Charles Forbes, commander of the Home Fleet, ordered most of the fleet to relocate to safer ports. Royal Oak stayed behind, as her anti-aircraft guns were still considered valuable to Scapa Flow's sparse air defenses. Sinking. Scapa Flow. Nestled in the heart of the Orkney Islands off Scotland's northern coast, Scapa Flow was a prime anchorage for the British fleet. This vast natural harbour could easily accommodate the entire Grand Fleet. It was encircled by islands with shallow channels and fast-moving tides, providing natural protection. Despite these advantages, the threat from U-boats was acknowledged early during the First World War. In response, several countermeasures were put in place. Key points were reinforced with sunken blockships, and floating booms were used to secure the 3 widest channels, managed by tugboats to allow safe passage for friendly ships. While it was considered unlikely that a U-boat commander could navigate through undetected, there were 2 attempts during the war. On November 23, 1914, U-18 was rammed twice before it ran aground, leading to the crew's capture. On October 28, 1918, UB-116 was detected by hydrophone and subsequently destroyed, resulting in the loss of all aboard. Throughout most of the First World War, Scapa Flow served as the main anchorage for the British Grand Fleet. During the interwar years, the primary base moved to Rosyth in the Firth of Forth. However, with the onset of the Second World War, Scapa Flow was reactivated to house the British Home Fleet. While the natural and artificial defenses remained formidable, they were seen as needing further enhancement. Early in the war, additional blockships were added to bolster these defenses, ensuring that Scapa Flow retained its strategic importance. Special Operation P, the raid by U-47. Shortly after the war began, German naval commander Karl Dönitz crafted a bold plan to attack Scapa Flow. This move aimed to disrupt the British blockade and seek vengeance for past defeats. He chose Kapitänleutnant Günther Prien to lead this daring mission, setting it for the night of October 13 to 14, 1939, under the cover of high tides and a moonless sky. Armed with detailed reconnaissance photos taken by Siegfried Niemeyer, Prien navigated U-47 into Scapa Flow through Kirk Sound, skillfully steering between sunken blockships. Despite the bright aurora borealis lighting the way, U-47 managed to avoid detection even when briefly illuminated by a passing taxi's headlights. Entering the harbor at 0:27 on October 14, Prien recorded his triumph in the log. Surprisingly, the anchorage seemed almost empty, as Admiral Forbes had ordered the fleet to disperse. Eventually, a lookout spotted Royal Oak, a Revenge-class battleship, and another vessel behind it, incorrectly identified as a battlecruiser but actually the seaplane tender Pegasus. At 0:58, Prien launched 3 torpedoes from U-47's bow tubes. 2 missed, but 1 struck Royal Oak's bow at 1:04, causing minor damage and severing the starboard anchor chain. Believing it to be an internal explosion, many sailors returned to their hammocks. Reloading, Prien fired another salvo of 3 torpedoes at 1:16. This time, all 3 hit, causing catastrophic explosions that blew a hole in the armored deck, wrecked mess areas, and knocked out power. A fireball from ignited cordite swept through the ship. Royal Oak quickly listed to 15 degrees, pushing open portholes below the waterline. She soon capsized and sank at 1:29, just 13 minutes after the second attack. The attack resulted in the deaths of 835 men, including Rear Admiral Henry Blagrove, and 134 boy seamen, the largest such loss in a single Royal Navy action. This tragedy highlighted Scapa Flow's vulnerability, prompting immediate security enhancements, including the construction of the Churchill barriers. Rescue efforts. As the chaos unfolded, the tender Daisy II, under the command of John Gatt, was moored to Royal Oak's port side. When the battleship began listing to starboard, Gatt swiftly ordered Daisy II to be cut loose. The vessel briefly caught on the rising anti-torpedo bulge of the Royal Oak before freeing itself and pulling away. Many crew members of Royal Oak who had managed to jump into the water were dressed in only their nightclothes, unprepared for the frigid temperatures. The surface of the water was thick with fuel oil, which filled their lungs and stomachs, making it even harder to swim. Those who tried to swim the half-mile to the nearest shore found the journey treacherous, and only a few survived. Royal Oak's port-side pinnace was maneuvered away from the sinking ship using wooden boards because there was no time to raise steam. Overloaded with men, the boat capsized 300 yards from the Royal Oak, throwing everyone on deck into the water and trapping those below. Gatt, with the lights of Daisy II turned on, and his crew began the rescue operation. They managed to pull 386 men from the water, including Royal Oak's commander, Captain William Benn. The rescue efforts continued tirelessly for another 2.5 hours until nearly 4 a.m., when Gatt finally halted the search for more survivors and transported those he had saved to the ship Pegasus. Boats from Pegasus and the harbor joined the efforts, and Gatt's actions were critical in saving almost all the survivors. For his heroic actions, John Gatt was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the only military award given in connection with the disaster. Pegasus had sent a message by signal lamp to the port signal station about 5 minutes after the sinking, stating General, "Send all boats," followed by Royal Oak is sinking after several internal explosions half an hour later. The total number of survivors from the tragedy was 424. Aftermath. The British initially couldn't determine why Royal Oak had sunk, suspecting an onboard explosion or an aerial attack. However, they soon realized a submarine attack was the most likely cause. By then, U-47 had already escaped. The BBC reported the sinking by late morning on 14 October, and the news was picked up by German listening services and U-47 itself. Divers sent down the next morning found remnants of a German torpedo, confirming the attack. On 17 October, Winston Churchill announced the loss of Royal Oak to the House of Commons, acknowledging the raid as a remarkable exploit of professional skill and daring, but stating it would not significantly impact the naval balance of power. An Admiralty Board of Inquiry, held from 18 to 24 October, examined how the anchorage had been breached. Meanwhile, the home fleet was ordered to remain in safer ports until Scapa Flow's security could be improved. Churchill had to explain to the House why so many young boys were aboard Royal Oak, most of whom perished. He defended the Royal Navy tradition of sending boys aged 15 to 17 to sea, though the practice was largely discontinued after the disaster, with under 18 serving on active warships only in exceptional cases. The Nazi propaganda ministry quickly capitalized on the successful raid. Hans Fritzsche's radio broadcasts highlighted the triumph felt across Germany. Prien and his crew reached Wilhelmshaven on 17 October and were greeted as heroes. Prien was awarded the Iron Cross First Class, and his crew received the Iron Cross Second Class. Hitler sent his personal plane to bring them to Berlin, where Prien received the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, a decoration later customary for successful U-boat commanders. Dönitz was promoted to Rear Admiral and became Flag Officer of U-boats. Prien, nicknamed the Bull of Scapa Flow, and his crew adorned U-47's conning tower with a snorting bull mascot, later the emblem of the 7th U-boat flotilla. Prien became a sought-after figure for interviews, and his ghostwritten autobiography, Mein Weg nach Scapa Flow, was published the following year. The manuscript, edited by the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht and the Reich Ministry of Propaganda, aimed at an adventurous tale for boys. When Prien received a copy, he made numerous corrections. In 1955, an English translation was published, and the ghostwriter, Paul Weimar, protested, saying the demonstrably false account should not have been published out of context, donating his royalties to charity. The Admiralty Board of Inquiry's report criticized the defenses at Scapa Flow and censured Sir Wilfrid French, the admiral commanding Orkneys and Shetlands, for their unprepared state. Despite his earlier warnings about Scapa Flow's inadequate anti-submarine defenses, French was retired. Following Churchill's orders, the eastern approaches to Scapa Flow were sealed with concrete causeways linking Lamb Holm, Glimpse Holm, Bury, and South Ronaldsay to mainland. These Churchill barriers, largely constructed by Italian prisoners of war, were completed by September 1944 and officially opened just after V Day in May 1945. A second report looked into the sinking of Royal Oak and the heavy loss of life, which was significant given the ship was in port and calm waters. The report concluded that many men below the main armored deck, sent to air defense stations, had their escape slowed by numerous watertight doors. The issue of deadlights, ventilated metal plates replacing glass panes in portholes during wartime blackout, was also examined. It was thought water flooding through these hastened the initial healing over, but closing the ventilators would not have saved the ship. A rumor later spread that Prien had been guided into Scapa Flow by a German agent, Alfred Waring, disguised as a Swiss watchmaker named Albert Ortel. After the attack, Ortel supposedly escaped in the submarine BO6 to Germany. This story, originating from a 1942 article by journalist Kurt Rees in the Saturday Evening Post, was later embellished by other authors. Post-war searches found no evidence of Ortel, Waring, or a submarine named BO6. In 1959, Orkney's prominent watchmaker, Mr. E. W. Hurton, assured the editor of the Orkney Herald that no such watchmaker had ever lived in Kirkwall. Orkney's chief librarian suggested in a 1983 letter that Albert Ortel was likely a pun on the Albert Hotel in Kirkwall. Survivors. Relatives reading the list of Royal Oak survivors after the sinking, the surviving crew of Royal Oak were accommodated in the towns and villages of Orkney. On 16 October, a funeral parade for the deceased took place at Lynes-on-Hoy. Many of the survivors, having lost all their clothing in the disaster, attended the ceremony in borrowed boiler suits and gym shoes. The Navy generally granted them a few days of survivors' leave before reassigning them to other ships and roles. Günther Prien, the commander of U-47, did not survive the war. He and his submarine were lost on March 7, 1941, possibly due to an attack by the British destroyer HMS Wolverine. The Nazi government kept news of his loss secret for 10 weeks. However, some U-47 crew members from the Royal Oak mission survived, having been transferred to other vessels. Remarkably, some of these sailors later met and formed friendships with former enemies from Royal Oak. The HMS Royal Oak Association holds an annual act of remembrance at Portsmouth, the home port of Royal Oak, on the Saturday closest to 13 October. Originally held at the Naval Memorial at Southsea, the event has in recent years taken place at St. Anne's Church, Portsmouth Naval Base. At the service on October 9, 2019, marking 80 years since the sinking, a memorial stone was unveiled in the church by Anne, Princess Royal, the Commodore-in-Chief of HMNB Portsmouth. Around 150 relatives and descendants of the crew attended the ceremony. Kenneth Toop, who survived the sinking while serving as a boy first class on Royal Oak, served as the association's honorary secretary for 15 years. Arthur Smith, the last remaining survivor of Royal Oak, passed away on December 11, 2016. Smith was a 17-year-old boy first class on watch on the bridge when the ship was struck. He jumped from the sinking vessel, initially swimming in the wrong direction until he was picked up by a boat and transferred to the tender Daisy II. Wreck. Status as war grave. Despite the relatively shallow waters where Royal Oak sank, the majority of the bodies could not be recovered. The wreck, marked by a buoy at 58 degrees 55'44" and 2 degrees 59'09" has been designated a war grave, prohibiting any unauthorized diving or exploration under the Protection of Military Remains Act 1986. In clear water conditions, the upturned hull can be seen reaching to within 5 meters of the surface. The brass letters that formed Royal Oak's name were removed as a keepsake by a recreational diver in the 1970s. These letters were returned nearly 20 years later and are now displayed at the Scapa Flow Visitor Center in Lynes. Each year, the Royal Navy commemorates the loss by placing a white ensign underwater at her stern. A memorial at St. Magnus Cathedral in Kirkwall includes a plaque dedicated to those who perished, beneath which a book of remembrance lists their names. This list of names was not released by the government until 40 years after the sinking. Each week, a page of the book is turned. The ship's bell was recovered in the 1970s, restored, and added to the memorial at St. Magnus. 26 bodies, 8 of which could not be identified, are interred at the Naval Cemetery in nearby Lyoness. Environmental concerns. Royal Oak sank fully fueled with approximately 3,000 tons of furnace fuel oil aboard. The oil leaked from the corroding hull at an increased rate during the 1990s, raising environmental concerns and leading the Ministry of Defense to consider plans for its extraction. The ship's status as a war grave required sensitive handling of surveys and proposed techniques for oil removal. Public opposition had halted plans to raise and salvage the wreck in the 1950s. Poorly managed efforts could destabilize the wreck, potentially releasing the remaining oil and risking the detonation of unexploded ordnance in the ship's magazines. The MOD commissioned a series of multi-beam sonar surveys to image the wreck and assess its condition. High-resolution sonograms revealed Royal Oak lying almost upside down with her top works embedded in the seabed. The tip of the bow had been blown off by U-47's first torpedo, and a gaping hole on the starboard side was the result of the triple strike from the second torpedo salvo. Following years of delays, Briggs Marine was contracted by the MOD to pump out the remaining oil. Royal Oak's conversion to fuel oil during construction had placed her fuel tanks in unconventional positions, complicating the operation. By 2006, all double-bottom tanks were cleared, and by 2010, 1,600 tons of fuel oil had been removed, stopping the active oil leakage into Scapa Flow. Approximately 783 cubic meters of oil are believed to remain, with plans to resume pumping in mid-2021. Royal Oak's tragic sinking remains a poignant chapter in naval history, a testament to the bravery and sacrifice of those who served aboard. From the initial confusion to the subsequent investigations and environmental concerns, the story of Royal Oak is one of enduring legacy and remembrance. The annual ceremonies and memorials ensure that the courage and lives of the fallen are never forgotten. Thanks for watching, The Animated General. Out.